Hey, up. So we've just finished economics, and now we're going to look at how the social patterns began to change. We're going to focus on nobles, peasants, and townspeople. When we look at this, it's called the estates system. Dr. Spavogo had estates in bold. I just want to make sure you understand an estate. There are three estates in a traditional society, and we see it right here. The first estate is going to be the clergy. We're going to talk a lot about them later. The second estate is going to be the lords, nobles, the nobility. They're the ones that own the large, vast lands. And then the third estate will be everyone else. And that everyone else is very diverse. And we're going to see how that plays out, but eventually becomes diverse. So let's look at the second estate, the nobility. The nobility makes anywhere between 2 to 3% of the population of Europe. They're very, very wealthy. They were the military and political leaders. They were also the economic leaders in the sense that they maintained their fiefs or these large tracts of land. They were, even though they may not have a lot of coinage like buy and sell, they dominated the area. And remember, they were the knights of the era. They were the only ones wealthy enough to have horses and armor, and they protected the serfs from these barbarian invasions. But during the Renaissance, aristocrats or these nobility, they're going to seek to change. They're going to begin to seek education and other opportunities because changes were being made for them. And this is a really, really, really important book. We will probably see excerpts throughout the next couple of weeks here. But Castelloni's Book of the Courtier. This is a really important text that really is important. So obviously, please make sure you highlight it. But this book really became the handbook for the nobility. And remember, I like what the textbook said, that he really defined three attributes of a modern noble or a Renaissance noble. Again, one of the purposes of this book is he's trying to tell the nobility things are changing and you must evolve too. If you don't evolve, you will lose power. So the three attributes, the first thing he talked about was endowment. You have these natural, they believe that the nobility had like special blood. They believe that they were endowed with special values, such as character and grace, and that everybody else did not have that character because they were born non-noble. Really kind of important there. But that's going to be the element that a noble has to have endowment. Number two, he identified that they must have these achievements. The first type of achievement they talked about a military and bodily exercises. You have to be physically fit. You must be strong. Remember, by the time you get to the 1500s, the idea of the nobles being necessary to be knights, they become outdated. And there's no longer needs for the nobles to be dominating the military. So he's warning them, going, hey, this is changing, and you cannot be lazy. A second type of cultural achievement he talked about was through classical education. During the Middle Ages, it was only about the physical fit. Again, Latin was a language people that they could read, but who cares? Well, now he's talking about this classical education, connecting to antiquity. The idea that you must be able to have, your culture, music, poetry, history, rhetoric, which is the art of speech, letters or the art of writing. And we do this not in Latin, but we do this in our vernacular, everyday language. So he's saying, we as nobility, yes, we have these special endowments, but we also need to become leaders through education. And the third part was the high standards of context, such as chivalry, that only the nobility knows how to treat gentlemen. They're the gentlemen of society. They know how to treat ladies. Ladies are not peasant women. Ladies are lords of the lord's wives. And so in that sense, he's really, really focusing on this. Times are changing, and we must change. We must maintain our endowment, become culturally aware, and have cultural achievements through bodily exercises as well as classical education, and we must display chivalry. Now, when we look at the third estate, again, the third estate really, this is a painting of a peasant. The third estate primarily was made of peasants. They made it, Dr. Spavogo points out, 85 to 90% of the population. A peasant is a poor rural farmer. Typically, they owe nobles feudal dues and duties. They're still, quote unquote, protected by the nobles, but there is a sense of freedom. But again, these peasants really don't own land. They don't have access to wealth. And really, their number one goal is survival because they don't have access to money. They don't have stores. So they're constantly farming. They're constantly trying to find food. They're constantly really on a survival level. If you go back to these days, peasant homes only had one room. And so you'd go into their house and they had one room. They had one bed. The whole family would live there. The family goat would be on that bed. Everybody would be in bed. This comes from a book I know called The World Before Fire, The World Lit Only by Fire. Really fantastic book. I believe it was by Manchester. But he really points out that really there's really no boundaries here, that everybody kind of just lived on the same bed. But before I get anywhere, I just want to point out they have no real wealth. And I want to emphasize peasants did not participate in the Renaissance changes. The peasants will remain peasants with very little changes until the 19th century. Let's look at the towns. The towns began to recover, right? The towns began to recover around the year 1000 with the end of the barbarian invasions. There was a slow emergence of merchants. By the time we come to the end of the Crusades and we begin to discuss Hansa, the nation of Flanders fleet, all of a sudden the towns become a little bit more bustling. The top of the group is the patricians. These are the entrepreneurs, the capitalist investors, and they dominate the land. In today's world, the patricians would be kind of like the Bill Gates of the world, or Jeff Bezos. A secondary group is the petty burghers. The petty burghers, though they weren't wealthy, they had some wealth. They were shopkeepers, they were artisans, they were people of means. They would begin to develop this new urban lifestyle, but a really small percentage. Nearly a majority of the urban dwellers are being the populist workers. There's no factories. There's no what we might call modernity yet. There's no opportunity for these workers. So these workers may have been kicked off their lands as peasants. They've come into the urban areas, and now they are really destined to have no wealth, very poor. And we're going to see we may do a document analysis of how they're viewed a little bit later, but we'll see. Now, when we look at slavery, this slavery is not this is not the transatlantic African slave trade. And really, it's not even about agricultural slavery. This is a very different version of slavery. When we look at this, the slaves, they were going to be people of northern Africa, as well as Eastern Europe, as well as Spanish, the Moors. So there's going to be a diversity of these slaves. And these slaves, they were skilled worker, artisans, they were nursemaids or servants. But around the time we get to the 15th century, really after 1453, there's two key reasons for the decline in slavery, especially in Italy. Humanitarianism of the Renaissance. We're going to talk a little about humanism later. They felt bad about enslaving people to a small degree. But probably the most significant we're going to talk about is the economic decline. After 1453, with this fall of Constantinople, Italy will not have the wealth any longer to really maintain the concept of slavery. We'll see this a little bit later. So what we've looked at is changes in the social developments. We've talked about they're going to maintain the estate system. We've identified and described the second and third estates in good detail. We know the second estate would be the nobility, and the third estate will be everybody else, including the slaves. So the third estate is going to be made up of peasants, townspeople, and slaves. And that's all part of this environment. And we'll see how that all plays out later.